this is one of the Bible studies that I don't want to give and you don't want to hear. Now, that's no reason to leave, stay, and it's no reason for me not to show up and give the study. It's just that it's not part of the Bible that we particularly like. It's not that it's a hard part of the Bible to understand, it's just a hard part of the Bible, for it says things and speaks a message using horrible imagery. For here we see the dreadful pictures of war. We live in such a wonderful city, such a prosperous city, such a safe and happy city. I mean, I don't fear walking down the streets. I don't fear being evicted from my home. And so you and I, we're removed from the very images, from the very pictures, the pictures of the war-torn refugees. We're freed from the cold and the hunger, from the heat of the desert and from being ill-nourished, from carrying all our worldly possessions in our back or in a cart in front of us. As we watch our children suffer, as we watch them sicken, as we watch our little ones die, we are freed from all this horror that is around about in Hosea chapter 9 and around about in our world today. And these pictures Hosea would have found horrifying. Hosea's contemporaries would have found unbelievable, because at the time Hosea is speaking, the nation is still in prosperity. The nation is still, well, it starts off chapter 9 of Hosea, "Rejoice not, O Israel, exult not like the peoples." That's what they were tempted to do. All is well with the world. Look where we are. But come, look at Hosea's pictures of war in the rest of the chapter. The war that would lead them from Assyria down to Egypt. For Assyria would attack Israel in the coming days and would destroy the cities of Israel and conquer its people. And when the barbarous hordes of the Assyrians come from the north, then the populace, the people, they would be fleeing, and the flight would be to the south and to Egypt, the next place that could possibly protect them from the barbarous hordes of the Assyrian army. They wouldn't go back to God, but they would go back to Egypt. They wouldn't return to the God of Moses who rescued them out of Egypt, but go back to the Pharaoh of Egypt that held them in slavery. And so you see there in verse 3, "They shall not remain in the land of the Lord, but Ephraim shall return to Egypt." Or down there in verse 6, "Behold, they are going away from destruction, but Egypt shall gather them, Memphis shall bury them. Nettles shall possess their precious things of silver, thorns shall be in their tents." They plundered the Egyptians, if you remember, under Moses when they left Egypt, but they will return to Egypt and lose all their possessions, all their treasures. And so throughout Hosea 9, we have the picture of warfare, the pictures of poverty, and the pictures of refugees, and the pictures of barren infertility. Firstly, poverty, for war impoverishes nations, and especially the little people of the nations. The big industrialists, the crooks of this world, they make money out of a decent war, but the little people are impoverished. The nettles will possess their precious things, thorns will be in their tents, verse 6. Here is the people returning to their enslavement. For they are going to wander the world as refugees. Now, we Aussies know about refugees. They wander here to us, don't they? They are desperate people seeking safety and security, which they are denied in their home country. And as refugees, and as long as they are refugees, they are permanently denied. Israel was promised their own homeland, where they could live at peace and security and safety. God's promised land flowing with milk and honey, like the Garden of Eden, paradise restored. But now, verse 3, "They shall not remain in the land of the Lord, but Ephraim shall return to Egypt, and they shall eat the unclean foods of Assyria." Or down verse 6, "For behold, they are going away from destruction, but Egypt, Memphis, they'll bury them." Or down to the end of the chapter, the very last words of the chapter, verse 17, they shall be wanderers amongst the nations. And their hopeless lack of future is typified in their infertility. You see, they have followed the fertility gods of Canaan, but they are going to lose all their fertility. Their desire for the prostitute's wages, becoming rich through the casual use of sexuality, is going to rebound to the failure of sexuality, the failure to reproduce at all. So you see it in the second half of chapter 1. For you have played the whore, forsaking your God. You have loved a prostitute's wages on the threshing floors. Threshing floor and vine shall not feed them. The new wine shall fail them. They have such promise of wealth and productivity in their whoredom with the gods, with the Baals, but it's not going to actually produce. They had such promise and wealth and productivity when God first lit his eyes upon them in the wilderness. In verse 10, like grapes in the wilderness, I found Israel, like the first fruit on the fig trees in its first season. Or down in verse 13, they are described as a palm planted in a meadow. They had such prosperity available to them, such fertility, such crops, such fruitfulness, but the failure to reproduce becomes an awful theme of the latter part of the chapter. Verse 11, Ephraim's glory shall fly away like a bird, no birth, no pregnancy, no conception. Even if they bring up children, verse 12, I will bereave them till there is none left. Woe to them when I depart from them. Or verse 13, Ephraim I have seen was like a young palm planted in a meadow, but Ephraim must lead his children out to slaughter. The end of verse 14, give them a miscarrying womb and dry breasts. It is the character of what God is doing. Look at verse 16, Ephraim is stricken, their root is dried up, they shall bear no fruit. Even though they give birth, I will put their beloved children to death. These are awful pictures. These are dreadful pictures, but they are the pictures of the refugees of war. It is the children who die. They are dreadful pictures, of course, to any of us who have had the difficulty of reproduction, the difficulty of fertility, be it in our marriage or those who long to marry and have children but never had the chance to. It's something that we can know the pain of, the intense suffering of being without the children whom we would love to love. Worse still, or is it, who knows what's worse in the suffering of this world, is to have your children, but to see them die in front of you. Whether it's as little children, or even after we've raised them, we've gone through all those years, even the dreadful teenage years, to see them die as adults. There's something deeply wrong with the world when your children die before you, when you stand beside the grave of your child. It's bad enough to stand beside the grave of your parents. It's bad enough when your children stand beside your grave, but somehow that's kind of normal. You expect it. But to stand beside your child's grave is a pain that is almost too great to bear. God knows it, for Israel was his son, and he was bringing it to death. God knows it, for Jesus was his son, who paid in his death for the sins of the world. But there's even more to it than the pain and suffering of the parents. There is the death knell of a nation. For there will be no Israel if there are no children. If all the children die, then where is our future? Our world, our hope, our meaning, our culture, our nation, who we are, what we are, it is all going to perish. We're going to be as extinct as the dinosaurs and the dodo. And all this is recompense for what we have done. For that is what Israel had to face. Their extinction was to be their own fault. They were suffering recompense for their own silly, immoral failure. Look across at verse 7, the days of punishment have come. The days of recompense have come. Israel shall know it. This destruction of Israel is not random. It's the purposeful action of God, the judge, giving his people recompense for their sin. That sin is indicated to us at the beginning of the chapter and throughout the chapter. It is the adulterous relationship of false religion, the adulterous relationship with the other gods, the fertility and prosperity gods of Canaan. And so verse 1, rejoice not, O Israel, exult not like the peoples, for you have played the whore. Forsaking your God, you have loved a prostitute's wages on all the threshing floors. And they've been doing this, why? From the time that Moses led them in the wilderness. For again, verse 10, like grapes in the wilderness I found Israel, like the first fruit of the fig tree in its first season I saw your fathers. But they came to Baal Peor and consecrated themselves to the thing of shame and became detestable like the things they loved. You're supposed to remember Baal Peor and the Baals of Peor. You're supposed to remember the time when the people of Israel were coming in and they took a little diversion as they enjoyed a party and an orgy with the women of the Baals of Peor and then got involved in that whole event. But it's not only them. Look down to verse 15. Every evil of theirs is in Gilgal. There I began to hate them because of the wickedness of their deeds, and I will drive them out of my house. Gilgal was the very foundation place of the nation. When they first came across the Jordan and settled, Gilgal was where the shrine was set up to remember the history of their salvation, and yet they have turned the shrine of Israel into the place of false worship of the Canaanite gods. Such is the sacrilege of Israel. It would have been better if they had left off the worship of Yahweh completely, but no, they have been more sacrilegious than that because they have mixed in the worship of Yahweh with the worship of the Baals. This is worse than deserting God. To make us like one of the other gods, the false gods, that are not gods, that do not even exist, that are but myths and legends. Here, my friends, is the multi-faith centre. Here is the multi-faith service. We here in the cathedral, we Christians are always being pressured by people who believe in false gods, by people who believe in no gods, by people who believe all gods are superstition, by governments of all persuasion. We are always being pressured to have multi-faith services. Been pressured even in this last week to conduct one out here in the square in just a few weeks' time. But if Yahweh is God, then there is no other God. And to mix God, the one and only, with false gods and lies and mistruth, why, that is a sacrilege that is not worth living for. But look here in verse 4 and 5. For they shall not pour out drink offerings of wine to the Lord, and their sacrifices shall not please him. It shall be like mourners' bread to them. All who eat of it shall be defiled. For their bread shall be for their hunger only, and it shall not come to the house of the Lord. What will you do on the day of the appointed feast, and on the day of the feast of the Lord? For behold, you're going away to destruction. Friends, Israel wanted to continue going into the house of the Lord and celebrating to him, but you can go through the form, but that doesn't mean you have the reality. You can eat the bread of the sacrifice, but you're actually eating defiled bread associated with death. It's actually doing you no good at all because God has no pleasure in them, verse 4. It is worse than if they had stopped doing it altogether. They are going into destruction. They're running away from the destruction of Assyria and going into the destruction of Egypt. And the slightly strange things to our ears is that this idolatrous religion, that they want to unite the worship of Yahweh with the worship of the Baals, this idolatrous religion will bring with it sexual immorality. But friends, that always is the case. The move away from the God who created the world to the worship of the creatures of this world is always accompanied by sexual immorality, the sexual immorality of the world. This was the sin of the Baal of Peor. Back in Hosea chapter 9 verse 10. This is what it was about. Sexual immorality connected to idolatrous worship, because idolatrous worship and sexual immorality always go together, because both are a worshipping of this world rather than a worshipping of the Creator who made this world. And so the sensuality of idolatry spills across into the sensuality of our lives. And sin is mentioned again in verse 9. They're the same kind of sin, verse 9, about Gibeah, and they have deeply corrupted themselves, as in the days of Gibeah. He will remember their iniquity. He will punish their sins. You see, there are things in our history that we remember, the names that we remember, because they are matters of great shame. In fact, sometimes we change the names so that no one will know what has happened. Lambing Flats. It means nothing to some people here. Hands up those who don't know anything about Lambing Flats. Yes, most of you don't know about Lambing Flats. And that's because there was a great massacre of Indigenous Australians at Lambing Flats and of Chinese during the gold rushes. And so we've changed the name of Lambing Flats to... who's come from there? I always have a trouble now because I think it's Young, but it could be Yass. Is it Yass or is it Young? Sorry? Young. They've changed it to Young. So we've got this lovely town called Young. But if you know the history, it's Lambing Flats. But we don't like the name Lambing Flats because it reminds us of what we are like. Gibeah? Gibeah was one of the worst places. It was the low water mark of Israel's history. Because there in Gibeah of Benjamin, the same thing that was done in Lot's day in Sodom and Gomorrah was done in Gibeah. Only it was done not by the pagans of Sodom and Gomorrah, but by the people of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin. You find it in Judges 19 and 21. It's the worst chapters of the Bible. It's just awful what was done in Gibeah. And it led to the first civil war within Israel, as all the other tribes of Israel were so horrified by what took place there in Gibeah that they went and destroyed Benjamin. So wicked was the city of Gibeah. And so they have deeply corrupted themselves, as in the days of Gibeah. God remembers. So Hosea 9 describes the justice of punishment and recompense. The people are being given what they deserve. This is the nature of God's justice, to give people what they deserve. It's retributive justice, as all true justice must be retributive. Either giving people reward because they deserve that, or punishment because they deserve that. Receiving not more than you deserve, nor less than you deserve, but exactly what you deserve. You want fertility gods instead of the God who gives fertility? Then your punishment is that you will get the fertility that the fertility gods can offer. Nothing. Zero. Zip. No children. No fruit. No productivity. Barren, unfruitful reality. For that is the fertility of the Canaanite fertility gods. It's like Romans 1. God gives them up to what they want. They say, I don't want God, the creator of all the world. I'd much prefer my statue of this and that. And so God gives them up to whatever they want. The punishment fits the crime. Butt out of my life, God. I'm going to run things my own way. And so God says, all right, I will stand back and let you run your life your own way. And the consequence? The corruption of mind and of body and of all relationships. And this is what's happened to our own society today. As our society has turned its back on God, what has it created in its place? Why, the empty raunch culture of sexually transmitted diseases and speed dating hookups and lonely people without spouse or children or family or home. We have now reached the stage of 40% of the homes of Sydney are occupied by a single person. Sorry, that's not one person across all 40% of the homes. That is, single dwelling is what we have in 40% of the households of Sydney. Now, for many, this is a good and right outcome of life, but when a whole society is like that, What does it say about the nature of our society and our culture? So now they become detestable like the objects of their idolatry in verse 10. They came to Baal Peor and consecrated themselves to the things of shame and became detestable like the things they loved. For Hosea 9 is describing the justice of God. It's not just happened automatically. It's God who is bringing down Israel. You see it in verse 9 where it says, He will remember their iniquity. He will punish their sins. It's not just an automatic consequence, it's the very hand of God. Verse 12, I will bereave them. Or down in verse 12 again, I depart from them. Or in verse 15, then I began to hate them. Or I will drive them out of my house. I will love them no more. What a terrible word to hear from God, that He hates us and loves us no more. 16, I'll put their children to death, beloved children to death. 17, my God will reject them. This is the active work of God, personally punishing the people who have rejected Him. And in the midst of this sinfulness and prosperity that was about to turn into judgment and poverty, stood a foolish prophet. Verses 7 and 8. The days of punishment have come, the days of recompense have come. Israel shall know it, the prophet is a fool. A man of the Spirit is mad because of your great iniquity and great hatred. The prophet is the watchman of Ephraim with my God, yet a fowler's snare is on all his ways, and hatred in the house of his God. So that is how the people treat the prophet. See, prophets do have honour, but not in their own country, not amongst their own people, not in their own home. They are treated there like idiots and fools who do not know what God is talking about. And this prophet is hated, even especially in the house of God. For they just set traps up here for him to show him his errors. Doesn't it remind you of the Lord Jesus Christ? How he was hated in the temple in particular, and how people came and asked him questions not to find out answers, but in order to trap him, in order to snare him. Here in Israel's history, they were starting well, but they were finishing very, very badly. Rescued out of Egypt by the great prophet Moses, they were now rejecting the prophets of their day, trying to trap them, hating them in the very house of God and calling him a fool and treating him like an idiot. When he, in fact, is the watchman, warning of the dangers that were to come, warning of the disasters that await. That is the role and function of the watchman. In verse 1, Israel wants to rejoice, for optimism buoys us along, doesn't it? She'll be apples, something will turn up, it'll be okay, don't worry, just be happy. But the prophet is saying, no, it's not all right. It's not going to go away. It's not going to turn out happily. It's time for you to stop and to turn back to God. For this is foolishness, this idolatry, this sexual immorality, and destruction is inevitably following this foolishness. I know, friends, that if I warn our society of the damaging consequences of our binge drinking, of our endless pursuit of our materialism, of the wickedness of our gambling and casino, of our 7-day-a-week shopping madness, of our sexual revolution and its disaster, I know that if I stand and warn society of this thing, then the society will make fun of me, dismiss me as a wowser, an old-fashioned, irrelevant extremist, a silly man of yesteryear, full of silly ideas. But friends, the judgment of God is coming on our nation because our nation has turned its back on God. It cannot expect to continue to receive the blessings of God living the way in which we now are. We're not Israel, but we are a people who knew God. We're not God's nation, Australia, but we're a nation that did acknowledge God and have received many, many blessings from his hand. And as a society, we cannot ignore God and turn our back on God as we've been doing lately and expect to continue to receive his blessings. That is a foolishness. So the problem of doing so is Hosea's historical examples are Gibeah, where the people were as wicked as Sodom and Gomorrah, Or Baal Peor, where they joined in sexual immorality and idolatry. Or Gilgal, where they turned the very shrine of God into the sacrifice of the pagans. But the real problem was summed up in verse 17. They have not listened. My God will reject them because they have not listened to him. And so they shall be wanderers amongst the nation. Here's the real problem. God has spoken and people won't listen. Hey, well done for being at Bible study today. Well done for taking time off to come and listen to the Word of God. You are quite right to do it. Well done for taking time to listen to God, but listen in order to obey what he has to say. Be wise. Build upon the rock, not upon the sands. And the rock that you build upon is the very Word of God. For the warning that the prophet gave is the same warning that the apostle gave in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. It's the same warning. You started well, but now you're fallen. You mustn't desire evil as they did. For we're told there that the events that took place in the Exodus, and it quotes particularly the Baals of Peor event, the events that happened in the Exodus happened, they took place. But it also says they took place as examples and were written down not for their sake, they were written down, we are told, for our sake, upon whom the end of the ages has come. The Old Testament, friends, is not a Jewish book, and the New Testament a Christian book. The Old Testament is a Christian book. What happened to the Jews happened for Christians. It happened so that we Christians would know what happened and would not desire evil as they did. God rescued a nation that fell before its salvation. God has rescued people from every nation. Let us make sure we do not fall. Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall.